On Friday evening last, I was out at the pub and I met there one of my friends from university. He's a city lawyer and he was telling me about how he'd recently been on secondment to BAE Systems, the weapons manufacturers. And so I teased him, asking him how he felt profiting from others' deaths. And he said, "Gosh, Jonathan, you always have to moralise, don't you? Some of us just want to get on crushing the poor for personal gain, and you've got to rub it in our faces." He had a good sense of humour about the whole thing. But it did bring home to me, briefly, what an awful person I can be to be out with at the pub when you just want a relaxing Friday evening, and I forget to turn off my sense of moral duty. Much like, I imagine, the way that Isaiah was to be with all the time. He does nothing else but lay down judgment against all those who he thinks are doing work against the will of God, and he does it for 60-something chapters that we have access to, and presumably for the entirety of his life. It may be why he got kicked out of so many cities and communities and spent a lot of his time living in caves and generally being chased around by local leaders at the time who didn't want to hear any more of the things that came out of his mouth. By the time we get to chapter 5, the reading that we heard this evening, Isaiah has already targeted the nation for its corruption, the worshipping community of the Jewish people, the city, God's people, all people, men and women, each with different charges levelled at them for the injustices that they're perpetuating. And in comparison, the critique that I made of my friend at the pub seems quite gentle to the vitriol that Isaiah can come out with. The thing that he does very well is speak not in generalities, but in specifics, which are, of course, much more cutting and much more uncomfortable to hear. It's easy to hear someone say to you, "Stop sinning," because you get the chance to decide what it is that you might be doing that you should not, and you can choose things that you don't really mind stopping doing. But that's not Isaiah's model. He instead goes right for the heart of the matter and levels at people precisely what he thinks it is that they're doing wrong. And he offers 6 woes in chapter 5 in the verses that we heard read today, and we'll explore them a little bit this evening. But first, a word of warning. Every commentary that I read about these passages over the course of about 400 years of English language commentaries on Isaiah, they all said how much they felt like the words of Isaiah were speaking precisely to the time in which they were writing. And of course, it's easy for us to mould Isaiah's criticisms and level them against whatever it is that we don't like going on in the world at the moment. And sometimes we'll be justified in doing that. And at other times, all that we reveal by that sort of use of the scriptures is our own prejudice. So listen to Isaiah's 6 woes as I go through them with you, and to my commentary on them, and also to your own responses to his accusations, and find the truth in the midst of all of that. The first 2 woes are about the love of wealth and the love of pleasure, and they are very much bound together, the 2 of them. The first is about the love of wealth, about greed. Isaiah addresses the greedy land grabbers, people that had become so greedy for the acquisition of land that they had reduced others to poverty with nowhere to live. No good result, he tells them, can come from the practice of this kind of rapacious greed. Well, you are listening to this evening a member of the Generation Rent, those of us who are feeling most acutely the housing crisis as we look at 1-bedroom flats that we'll never be able to afford to own. And in our nation, we, even among developed nations, show such significant inequality of wealth and income that it is almost replicated nowhere else in the world. In the last couple of years, the average income for the richest fifth has increased by 5%, and for the poorest fifth has fallen by 1.5%. And wealth, even more than income, is unequally divided. The 10% of richest households in our nation hold about half of the wealth, the poorest 50% less than 10% of it. And from that greed, Isaiah pronounces a woe upon those who are self-indulgent. He speaks of those who are addicted to alcohol and to sensual living, those who seek to satisfy themselves with ever more worldly pleasure, regardless of what it might cost others, or indeed what it might cost them themselves. And the punishments that Isaiah speaks of for these first two sins, these first two woes, are more the evidential result of living out lives like that than they are some particular crashing in of God with a punishment. He says that those who dispossess others of land, buying houses and ground for themselves, will find at the end of all of it that they are alone. It is well documented, and I'm sure you know too, that material greed goes hand in hand with loneliness and distrust of whatever neighbours it is that you happen to have left. And that can never be more evident than the very practical way in which people make themselves lonely that Isaiah is speaking about here, by buying out their neighbours from underneath them and leaving them with no neighbours at all. We might, in this borough, reflect upon the fact that we have parishes here who represent both the richest fighting in at the moment, and just north of us, those that represent the poorest 5% of the country, living side by side. And further than that, the principal social ill in this parish is elderly loneliness. Likewise, Isaiah speaks eternal truth when he tells those who seek out worldly pleasure that they will only find themselves becoming hungrier and hungrier no matter how much they feast, and they will only find themselves becoming thirstier and thirstier no matter how much they manage to drink down. And their insatiable desire builds for themselves a prison in which they will live out the rest of their days. Isaiah's third woe he delivers in, at least in the version that we heard, in the King James Version, in this rather inscrutable verse: "Woe unto them that draw iniquity with cords of vanity, and sin, as it were, with a cart rope." The image that he's going after here is a person bowed over with a thick cart rope over their shoulder or over both, and dragging behind them the great weight and burden of their sin. He's talking about people who have harnessed themselves to their sin, who are dragging it along with them everywhere they go. Not because they're particularly proud of it, but because they believe that it carries no weight. They can't see the impact it's having on them, of making them crooked and bent over, of dragging them down. Because for their mind, there is no God to judge. They sin just because they can, and they dare God to do something about it. The fourth and the fifth woes come as a pair, just like the first and the second did. They are the loss of discernment and the pride that arises from it. Isaiah aims his fourth woe at those who have lost the power of moral discretion, people who can no longer distinguish evil from good, light from darkness, bitter from sweet, he says. He speaks of a time when truth loses its power, its meaning, because lies become common parlance, and mistruth is spoken at such a rate and with such conviction as to be indiscernible from reality. And having lost the ability to discern truth and untruth, good and evil, Isaiah prophesied against those who, in their self-conceit, feel no need of God. They cut themselves off from the source of true wisdom, and instead they trust only in themselves. There's a line that we say at morning prayer. There's a responsory in morning prayer where we say back and forth, the person leading it and those who are participating, we say back and forth the same words one to another. They change every season, but the one that I particularly love is when we speak back to each other these words: "Be not wise in your own sight." And they're particularly good when you're sitting there with people that you disagree with, or people that you're a bit cross with recently, and you can really spit it out at them. Be not wise in your own sight. And they spit it out back at you. And you, be not wise in your own sight either. And it gets to the heart of the matter of the inevitability of our pride, that it's very difficult for us to operate on the assumption that we're probably wrong and others probably right. That we find it much easier to think ourselves right and to trust ourselves rather than our wider communities and God. And Isaiah's final word is against injustice. Those same people, he says, who were greedy for intoxicating beverages and personal possessions, they're the ones who are now sitting in judgment. He says they are perverting justice. They're getting in the way of righteousness being carried out. And the ones who are suffering most at their hands are the poor. Those are the woes that Isaiah levels at his community and those in his own time. And I'm sure, just as the commentators over the last 400 years have heard echoes for their own time, you can hear echoes for your own time too. We read Isaiah in Advent because this is a time of preparation, a time when we think particularly about repentance, about our own sin and about the sin of our nation, about turning back to God as we prepare to welcome his Son at Christmas and as we await Jesus' return to us. And thanks to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, we'll also be reading Isaiah regularly around election time, for the foreseeable future at least. And that too is fitting, because Isaiah is a very political prophet. He's one who calls each member of the nation to account for their own sins, but he also calls each member of the nation to account for the sins of themselves as a collective, the sins of the nation itself. Isaiah wouldn't have accepted as an excuse, well, I didn't vote for that. He held God's people responsible, both for their own actions and for their corporate actions. And his underlying belief in this is that individuals' actions count, and that together they are the sum of the actions of a nation. And that as much power as a nation's leaders might have, they only have it when their subjects carry out their instructions. And Isaiah knew, and he preaches, that on a local level, the most influential effect on a community is not national fiat, but local practice, how we live out our lives. And so we follow in his twofold path, both calling our nation to repentance and encouraging it to pursue God's ways, and also by demonstrating that the very thing we are calling our nation to do, we are doing first by living it out in our own lives. Amen.